period, not so?
That's correct.
You were involved in extensive covert operation for what was then called the Blanke Seksie, is that not so?
That is correct.
Just inform the court, what did the Blanke Seksie entail? What was the job of the Blanke Seksie?
My Lord, the security branch was basically divided along racial lines, which I suppose is very much what South Africa was in those years. You had a section that specialized in so-called white affairs, one that specialized in Indian affairs, one that specialized in colored affairs, and of course a very large section that specialized in black affairs. So all matters relating to that racial classification would be the responsibility of that section. You then had your field workers and you had an investigation branch where any case after the field work had been done and your field operatives like I was, or your agents in the field, would accumulate information, and when it was seen by the state that this could be a case that could come before a court and dealt with by a court, it was handed over to what was known as the investigation branch. The investigation branch became somewhat infamous because they were situated on the 10th floor of John Vorster Square, and I worked on the 9th floor of John Vorster Square.
Thank you, Mr. Erasmus, for that background. We'll go into more depth of Stratcom later. In 1993, you were discharged from the police on medical grounds, post-traumatic stress syndrome. That not so?
That is correct.
But in your 17 years and while you work at the security branch, you kept all your case books and the documents pertaining to that?
That is correct. My Lord, just for the benefit of the court, these are actually state documents. They were supposed to be handed in, but I regarded them as a personal work record. So I just kept them in my cupboard, and as I moved to other areas within the security branch, I took this and a lot of documentation with me.
But that's extensive documents and extensive case books that you kept with you, the original
yes,
ones?
It's my full record of 11,000 cases that I investigated or was involved in during my tenure in the security police.
Okay, you gave evidence before the Goldstone Commission, not so?
That is correct.
And you also applied for amnesty before the TRC?
That is correct, my Lord. I applied for 80 incidents involving some 526 criminal offences, for which I was given, for the bulk of it, amnesty, and in a few instances amnesty was denied or couldn't be given because of the circumstances.
Okay, I want to move over, before getting to Stratcom, to first your field of operation and dirty tricks. You were more a field operator and you had to work after hours, not so?
That is correct.
Can you please inform the court that you have to put pressure on suspects and that you became aware of any dirty tricks? Tell us in your own words how that progressed.
My Lord, as a very young man, I entered into a world at 19 or 20 years old that I didn't know existed. I was obviously very attracted by this James Bond type secret agent thing. And my immediate commander was a Colonel J.H.L. Jordan. Came into my office the one day, and he closed the door and he said to me, the young guys go out at night and they go and monitor the suspects. And he said sometimes they're naughty. He said, because you know that these people are the biggest threat to our South African way of life. He gave me this long speech, which I recall with some detail, about what government policy was and what the security branch's policy was, and that was to, especially with the white left wing, force these people, terrorize them, use whatever means possible to get them out of the country. And this thought process persisted for many years afterwards. I heard it on security courses and in many, many fora, that the powers that be believed that black people in this country could not organize a revolution if it wasn't for the white communists that were behind them and in their midst. And it's for that reason that most of these if I may use the phrase, nocturnal activities that I participated in were against known white people that were listed under the suppression of communism, like Mrs. Helen Joseph, the Weinberg family, and many, many others.
So did you become involved in these dirty tricks?
I did. It was extremely exciting for a young man, and what was incredibly attractive was the fact that we basically knew from the outset that you were given this license to break the law willy-nilly.
Could you break into premises, for instance?
Well, my first sort of bit of fame in the security branch came when I did a very routine investigation on a Wit student by the name of Diana McLaren. And I went, which was unusual actually, I went on my own to her flat in Braamfontein and managed to get into the flat and found a literal goldmine of security value information. She was studying, if I remember, political science, and a lot of the stuff was found to be of great interest. And I sort of embellished a little bit as well that I'd managed to get in there, and that's I think I was seen then as somebody that could become one of the naughty boys and could be used in circumstances like at a later stage. I wasn't scared to break into premises. I would do anything to achieve the goal that was set out to me.
I don't want to dwell too long on the dirty tricks department, but were you given sometimes the means to do dirty tricks, bokpoort and that kind of thing? Can you explain to the court what is bokpoort and the new generation tear smoke?
My Lord, the issue of bokpoort is something that is so bizarre that I'm certain a lot of people in this court might not even find it anything less than humorous, but at a stage, I believe it was military or the military intelligence, probably Dr. Wouter Besson, was tasked to create a super stink bomb which we could use to break up meetings, disrupt events, and we were issued with these glass bottles which were about 3 times bigger than your standard stink bomb that my Lord's children might buy, for example, at a novelty shop and last for 5 minutes. This product, whatever it was, once it was poured out, was a smell I could only describe from hell itself, and it didn't go away. I applied for amnesty for using this to stop a UDF meeting at St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg. It's ironically a church where I was baptized, christened, which I suppose gives some sort of measure of my ideological commitment at the time. But nevertheless, I went there at 3 o'clock in the morning with somebody else and threw 2 bottles of this evil stuff out. And they had to replace the carpets, some of the benches. The meeting didn't take place because nobody could go into the church. This was on a Sunday morning. I think it's probably about 2 o'clock. This was the type of activities that we were doing on behalf of the state and with the state's full blessing and sanction.
You even thrown some of that into a colleague's car, not so?
Well, yes. Once again, something of a humorous moment was a colonel that I worked with decided that he'd had enough of people misusing the secret fund for private purposes and stealing money from the secret fund, which was quite rife at that time. And he threatened to take this matter to the Commissioner of Police in head office. So he was immediately branded a traitor. And a very enterprising gentleman, one of our colleagues, took a bottle of the stuff and threw it into his police car.
Okay. Mr. Erasmus, what I really called you for is because of Stratcom. I want you to explain to this court exactly what is Stratcom, how was it structured, what units in the security police worked with Stratcom, and what it entailed, and how does it entail to disinformation. So if you can explain to this court, Stratcom, please.
Lord, it's quite an involved thing. I'll start right at the top. There was 4 parts of the government or the state organs which carried out Stratcom. But to inform you, my Lord, of what Stratcom is, the word is an acronym for strategic communication. Strategic being, these were matters that were in the interest of the country as a whole and our society as a whole and of great importance. The second word is, of course, self-explanatory, but the word became then Stratcom. And this was based on a lot of philosophies that, I recall one of them, there was an American author by the name of McEwen wrote a manual on counter-revolutionary warfare. They took all of these principles and encompassed it in, which was an informal unit, which then became a formal unit in 1983, carried out by primarily the South African Police, Foreign Affairs under Mr. Pick, the old Bureau of State Security, BOSSEL, which is, I believe, now known as NEA. And these were the organs, of course, and military intelligence, the militaries. Sorry about that. Hundreds of projects were set up to get into every facet of life in South Africa, from the church that you went to the education that your children received from grade 1 in school. The thinking behind this, and a lot of very top people were brought in, historians, for example, on the school issue, was to prepare people and make them, this was very much a Cold War thing, aware of certain things, create certain impressions, and ultimately, in a way, I could imagine that if this was applied rigorously enough, the population could be controlled. There was two sides to this information, which it effectively was. I'm sure everybody will understand the term information and disinformation. It's very popular now to call stuff like this fake news. You're finding it every day on social media where I read, for example, last week, Richard Branson had died. People just create these things, and it's a big issue now in America. In South Africa, it became a way and a very effective and possibly the most effective tool that the old South African government, nationalist government, had of fighting the liberation movements. In my tenure in this, we stopped at absolute nothing. We had laissez-faire to do anything. My own little credits ranged from telling the world in magazines across and newspapers across the world that the ANC were a bunch of murdering thugs. Winnie Mandela was a drunken woman of low morals. Peter Makabe was even worse. We never ever stopped churning out information. The ideal formula for doing this type of stuff was espoused by Dr. Joseph Goebbels, who was one of Adolf Hitler's henchmen during the Second World War, and the National Party took those principles, believe it or not. And it basically was that you could fool people, and you could fool them totally, and the perfect solution to putting this thing into people's minds was a 70-30 formula. So if I can use a pretty crass example, Soweto Security Branch would send us a report to a Stratcom unit, or to me, in fact, and they'd say that Mama Winnie Mandela had a party that night and had a couple of people around for guests. I would take that situation and I would turn this into, that was a party that had never been held before in Soweto. And I would drop these little caveats of news onto this massive informer network that covered the whole of South Africa. And the successes of this, eventually I was given commendations because I actually achieved and got a commendation for putting material like this in the hands of the British Prime Minister, senior members of the British government, and unbelievably the head of NATO, Sir Walter Walker. I had a conversation with him, a warrant officer in the South African Police, talking to General Sir Walter Walker.
Let me ask you some pointed questions. Did you do some artistic work for Stratcom operations?
Yes. A very big part of my job, and I think maybe how I got involved in this type of thing was, my intentions initially was to study art, and I love drawing and that. So I was asked to draw posters, which people in the court may remember that suspiciously appeared overnight all over South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for God's sake, you're killing our children. I did one that went up at 20, 30,000 black schools overnight in South Africa with the spectre of death hovering over the school saying, look who's killing your children. Of course, behind it was the hammer and sickle. These were all to terrorize the population, scare them. And a lot of them were very ineffectual simply because if you had to try and find out who was this third force, you only had to look who's got the capability of printing 100,000 posters and putting them up all in one night right across the Republic of South Africa.
Let me ask another pointed question. Did you forge documents?
Unfortunately, it was very good, not only on the writing side, but on the forging side, and spent many, many hours, much to the mirth of my commanding officers, practicing Archbishop Desmond Tutu's signature, which was used on many occasions, one of them which, my Lord, I don't know if I should tell the story.
My Lord, I see it's already 11 o'clock. I don't know when you want to take your tea adjournment.
11:15.
11.
I think if you can just cover this aspect of it.
Please just cover this aspect.
My commanders came to me the one day with a letter. I just need 1 minute to just explain how this worked. All post coming into the Republic of South Africa and leaving the Republic of South Africa was channeled through Jeppe Street Post Office, where in the basement, the security branch had a staff of retired policemen who worked. This operation never ever ceased, worked around the clock. All the mail was examined, and anything of possible security interest was taken, placed in huge wool bags, driven down the road to John Vorster Square into the basement, and the ground floor, which was also security branch offices, had an assembly line, my Lord, of old policemen with kettles steaming open envelopes, supervised, of course, by security policemen on that staff, and anything of interest was either destroyed if it was necessary, or it was kept, and then the letter was resealed and allowed and was released. And on a day, somebody had written to Bishop Tutu and offered him, an American woman had offered, she was the administrator of a grant which had a vast fortune of somebody that had deceased, and this money was destined for philanthropic purposes. So she wrote to Bishop Tutu and she said she'd like to start the proceedings now where she would like him to get a lot of this money. That letter never went back to her, but what did go back to her was a letter that I forged where it said, "Dear Mrs. So-and-so, we resent you, white capitalists, interfering in our internal affairs. Thank you very much, but no thank you. We really don't need your money." It was actually insulting, and the idea was to stop her once again putting money into the Liberation Hands movements or to an enemy of the state like we saw the Archbishop at that time.
So you forged the letter with the signature of Archbishop, and you were the author of that.
It was sealed up and posted back to her again. There was many other incidents of this, some of them with tragic results. Letters and mail coming into Kusatu was intercepted by a colleague of mine who went to a First National Bank in Hillbrow, opened an account under a false ID in the name of Mr. Osatu, Charles Osatu, and was then able to get intercepted checks from the WH11 postal interception system, take them to the bank, and by simply inserting a dot or a comma, as Mr. Charles Osatu was able to cash them. So there was theft happening at that time on a pretty big scale.
While we've still got a little bit of time here, the In-conscription campaign, was any campaign against the In-conscription campaign?
Much of what we did was to discredit people that were becoming a danger to the state. In the In-conscription campaign, we're encouraging largely students and people that faced compulsory or obligatory national service. The thing was to stop conscription, as the name implies. And via the informer network, we found out that they're having what was known then as a sticker blitz. The same type of stuff that we used to do at night with big posters. They'd had thousands of little yellow stickers made with a peel-off backing strip that they were going to put on poles and shops and doors and that right across Joburg. And we managed via the informer to get hold of a couple of thousand of these, bought paint remover and put our own backing strip on and stuck them on every motor car that we could find in Joburg, and including some motorbikes owned by a very notorious bike club. The effect of this was obvious. These guys were red-faced the next day. They didn't even realize what had happened. But every one of those people that ever had that sticker on the car was certainly out to flatten one of these guys if they ever saw them. So that was quite a damaging thing and regarded as a very successful operation.
What was Operation Romulus?
The Stratcom operations, my lord, were finalized in 1983, and if I can just backtrack, when I joined the security branch in 1997, these things were done on a very ad hoc type basis. And
1997, 79.
I mean, I beg your pardon. For the first couple of years, were done on a very ad hoc type basis. Each security branch unit would be doing its own little number, and in the late, towards, I'm sure it was 79, a policeman was caught in Cape Town, and there was almost a huge, well, there was a huge palaver, but he just managed to escape prosecution. He managed to get away with it. And he was one of these so-called right-wingers, the third force that was operating at night. And I believe that alarmed the State Security Council and the nationalist government, because in 1983, a cabinet meeting was held where the entire cabinet were present. They were addressed by the head of the State Security Council, who had probably more power than what Botha did those years. And they decided to formalize and expand on these operations and control them to avoid the type of situation that could have arisen in Cape Town. So these operations and projects were given names, and the biggest one of them, the most heavily funded one, was known as Operation Romulus, and the basic definition was any action that one could carry out which could damage any of the liberation movements. And 8 years later, when they became alarmed about the AWB, they somehow added the AWB into that definition as well. So it was, up until the release of Mr. Mandela, it was known as, that was the defined principles of it.
Yeah. I see, as an annexure to your statement, if we just look at Annexure A to your statement, it specifically refers there under point 2, die aksie moet onder projek Romulus hanteer word en moet ten doel hê om die SAKP 'n meelsteel om die ANC se nek te maak. And if we can just read number 4 there, u kan die aksie loods met alle vermoëns waaroor u beskik. Daar word spesifiek gedink aan die volgende: pamflette, fronte, media kontakte, inligting en benutting beriggewer, RS-agente en medewerkers. Does this relate to Operation Romulus and what you could do under Operation Romulus?
That is correct, my lord, and I do believe that this particular document actually even bears the Minister of Police's signature on it. And if it's not this one, I've got a similar one, an original, despite what he told the TRC, and I'm talking about Mr. Adrian Vlok, a renowned liar, because he's told the TRC under oath he'd never given anybody an order to commit, any policeman an order to commit an unlawful action. but his signatures on all of these type of documents, and money was made available via his office for these purposes. This was a huge operation at that time that this particular document was written.
Right. Before I'm going on to disinformation about the ANC in foreign countries, I think, my Lord, it's best that we take the adjournment now.
Okay. Thank you. We'll take an adjournment at this stage, and we'll come back at 11:30, whereupon we'll proceed with your evidence.
Thank you. It's amazing. Nee. Polsen. Het hulle mekaar herken? Ja, dink toch nie.
Okay.
Ik wil niet nou, ik zal het altijd. Maar het is laatst krijgen hem al. Okay, let's do it. Let me just warn you. Shut up. You must help me, huh? The fourth one's
Wat Yes, we're connecting a mic now. Who is she talking to? Michelle. Also, Peter Francis Erasmus. Paul Francis Erasmus. I'm going to go Paul. Yeah, because that's what I said to Andrew. Francis, give middle name. Yeah. Okay. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, guys, you can test.
You're still under oath. Yes, may I proceed?
Mr. Erasmus, we were just busy with you doing any disinformation about the ANC in foreign countries. Were you ever personally involved in disinformation about the ANC in foreign countries?
I received 7 commendations. Became very well known in the structures for the successes that I had, especially with regards to being able to put quality information. When I say quality, my lord, it was the usual old formula of 50% or 70% or whatever into the hands of none other than the British Prime Minister. The effect of this, in one instance that I'm aware of, I didn't always have a mechanism of gauging how effective I was, because I was just a very small little bottom feeder. And that would have been known to my bosses in the Nationalist Party, was that the British government, I understood, had promised an amount of £16 million to Nelson Mandela, and after Mr. John Major read the drivel that I dished up to him, complete with pictures of this Mayo-style communism that was going to come to place in South Africa, he reduced the amount to £6 million. Another success was sending out police footage where I removed all record of the origins as an actual footage, videotape of a necklacing. I managed to get onto Japanese TV, and as I recall, they didn't, when they saw it, they were horrified. They didn't even want Mr. Mandela to visit Japan at that stage. There was a bit of a diplomatic embarrassment. So these things were very successful.
I want to talk to you about Sinn Féin, letter to Sinn Féin, specifically because that relates to the issues in this case. Did you ever send a letter to Sinn Féin? And can you describe to us what that was?
Well, one of the big Stratcom targets was the upcoming 48th anniversary of the ANC. And another letter, one of the letters that I did send to John Major, was a forged invitation from the ANC to the IRA to attend this 48th conference. And the British government were absolutely horrified. If one realized that at that stage of the game, they were still fighting the IRA tooth and nail in Northern Ireland. And here was the people they'd have to do business with, a prospective new South African government that was already in bed with these guys, and this was before the actual handover of power to the ANC.
But what about the signature of Raymond Sutton?
That was lifted off one document of itself and placed on a forged letter of invitation from the ANC.
If we look at Annex B to your statement, we'll see there a letter purportedly being given out by the African National Congress, and there Raymond Sutton. You say you lifted that signature of Raymond Sutton?
That is correct. One can actually notice that I don't think Mr. Suttner would have actually signed that way. If you just look at it, it doesn't line up. It's because they had problems at that stage with the machine that I had to use, which was a rather primitive piece of equipment.
And you made this forgery?
Yes.
Okay, and if we can continue along this same line, because that's the relevance for me specifically. If we talk about Mr. Dave Dalling.
The enemies of the National Party were many, and included obviously people in the opposition ranks of the then Parliament. One of them was very critical of de Klerk, and his cronies was, of course, Mr. Dave Dalling. And a rumour had been spread, I do believe, by Stratcom agents that worked in the media, and there was hundreds. The media obviously a prime target, that Dave Dalling might cross the floor, as it were, and declare himself by joining the ANC. So we decided to embarrass him and I forged a check with his signature on for the 12 rand, that's what it was those years, membership to join the ANC, and had it delivered to the newspapers who headlined it. Of course, he was attacked, the minute this came out, he was attacked by members, de Klerk and company would have used this now as a means to say to him, but Mr. Dalling, you're already a member of the ANC, and yet he was so confused because the forgery was very good. I must say to him what credit, and sadly. He wasn't even certain that he hadn't, in fact, I think his first reaction was he said that somebody put checks in front of him, he didn't know what he was actually signing. But he did deny it, which caused him some embarrassment.
I think Annexure D to your statement is a classical example of Stratcom. If you can take us to the Alexandra Civic Association pamphlet and can tell us what was your involvement with this Exhibit D. This leaflet, where did it come from? Who developed and whose handiwork is this?
This is my artwork. Information was received. There was Alexander Township in Johannesburg was quite a hotbed of political activity at that time, and there was two organizations promoting this or fomenting this dissent in Alex at that time, and the target here was a gentleman by the name of Moses Mayakisa and Obed Bapela, Richard Marikani, and a couple of other members. We'd found out that they'd actually moved out of Alexander Township and moved into, I think one of them was staying in Ponty buildings. So the whole thing here was, how could these guys be revolutionaries and representing the people and they didn't even live in the place anymore? So I drew this originally with a Koki pen, and it was corrected by the government printing service who did all our printing. And I think they printed 100,000 or something like this, which were once again dumped all over the township that night, and had a very negative effect on the target group that would have been, of course, Moses Mayakisa, Mr. Bapela, Richard Marikani, and others.
If we go to the second page there, it stated they're issued by the Alexandra Civic Association. Obviously that's a lie. That's a false.
It's totally a fabrication from our side.
Right.
To just explain that I was not this genius that had all of this. Every day I was given sometimes a box full of stuff that could be of so-called Stratcom value. And I was very hard-pressed to try and do something with these things because of the time limit, and I didn't know everything. So it worked like this. As the Stratcom agent, people in the intelligence community would invariably come and see me, or they saw a situation which we could have used, and I would put something together.
To conclude on Stratcom, I just want to ask you, was any front organizations formed?
My lord, yes, there was. There was news agents formed. One of them was by a colleague, Mr. Marco Bellingham, ex-captain Marco Bellingham, and I set up, and two other people set up a thing called PANA, Pan-African News Agency, which I believe still carried on for many years after all of this. On the trade union side, we set up a thing called CAFESA, Confederation of South African Trade Unions, and that was obviously to counter groups like COSATU and try and find some moderate support, and in this way oppose groups, enemy groups like, of course, COSATU and Nihawu and the rest of it.
And the support police group also?
Correct.
To conclude, I want to ask you, was it within the state's powers to falsify documents, pamphlets, leaflets, or not?
Well, I had, at the end of my tenure in John Vorster Square, we actually moved out to secret offices that were rented for this purpose, and under a front company known as Lamont Market Research. No, I don't know if they're still going, but we moved out to executive offices in Randburg, and I had a room full of typewriters, every pen, type of paper, fax machine, And I actually had a staff headed by an elderly man who's in his 80s, who'd been in British intelligence, believe it or not, in the Second World War. And his sole job, my lord, was to sit at night and write with either one of his hands, and he was very good at it, as I was, but the volume was just too much for me. I would write letters from Mr. John Caniso in Atteridgeville, criticizing the ANC, and then they would print that in the newspaper. But the letters looked so good, and we'd complete the effect by letting them get now dirty, drip candle wax on them, and none of them were ever the same. And I think the highlight of this whole campaign was in one day, I personally wrote all the letters to the editor in the Citizen newspaper, and I wrote the editorial. And the whole thing was one huge monster attack on the ANC's branches in Johannesburg. So, sorry to answer your question, yes, we definitely had the ability to forge and create anything that we wanted to.
I want to move over to a new subject, and that's torture at John Vorster. Now, being at John Vorster for the bigger part of your 70 years in the security police, did you ever observe torture on suspects or even witnesses at John Vorster?
Yes, I did, my lord.
What methods were used?
Well, I should maybe just give a little, if I may, my lord, just give a little bit of the history. When I joined as a young security policeman, Soweto was a section that was security branch was run by Johannesburg security branch from John Vorster Square. So we would go on these huge raids together with the Soweto security branch guys and catch the first terrorists that were being identified and being apprehended in South Africa at that time. And I witnessed the first torture that I ever saw on a vast scale on the 10th floor at John Vorster Square, where this man's testicles, and I've asked forgiveness if I can give any details, were being crushed by Colonel Cronrod, who was then Major Cronrod. And what struck me at the time was the, I must just say this, it was the severity of this attack. And I often wondered if I'd be called on to do things like that. But for the rest of my life as a field worker, our job was not really on the investigation staff, but we were called on regularly to do interrogations. I think one either had the stomach for it or you didn't. I do know about the various, I don't know if you want me to elaborate, the various forms of torture that we used, or pressure that we used on people. My own role was, I'd say, more common assault or creating a fear factor by slaps and stuff like that. But I have dealt with all of that in my amnesty application. But yes, torture was standard procedure, and the basis of this was sleep deprivation, if it was time permitting. The pressure was on the investigator and the interrogators to get the information as quick as possible. I went on a security course in 1978, and my notebook actually exists to this day, which I've got here with me. And I think over a period of about 2 days, we were lectured on methods of interrogation, stroke torture. Although, to be quite fair, they never ever said, this is how you hit somebody, or this is how you use electric shock machine. But in point number 4 of the notes, which I took down quite pedantically or very accurately, and writing in Afrikaans, because the lecture, of course, was in Afrikaans, I wrote there, totale vrees. Vrees, hy kan enige oomblik vernietig word. The aim of this psychologically was that the person that you were interrogating, you had to get control of that person's psyche as quickly as possible. Sleep deprivation being a major part of this would disorientate the people. They'd be given meals at irregular times, your body clock would go out, And then, of course, like you see in the movies, there was always the good guy, bad guy. One guy would go in there and beat the hell out of the detainee, and 2 minutes later, a gentle soul would come in and say, no, man, you can't carry on like this. You're going to die in this place. Just tell me this. And of course, these methods worked. But yes, to answer your question, I do realize that you would wanted some elaboration on this. I saw too many tortures and interrogations where physical violence was used to even give you an accurate number. There was many. And I was not an investigator, per se.
Yeah. The one other relevant part that I wanted to touch with you is your involvement with the inquest of the Neil Aggett matter. Were you involved in the events after the death of Neil Aggett?
That is correct, my lord.
Tell us in your own words exactly what was your role.
Well, on a day I was visited by a young Lieutenant Stephen Peter Whitehead in my office on the 9th floor. Whitehead worked for Cronwright, Colonel Arthur Benoni Cronwright on the 10th floor. And quite personally, I didn't like him. He had this meteoric rise to becoming an officer. He was a pretty arrogant guy, but he came in and he said to me, we've chosen you to accompany me on almost a mission impossible. We're going to travel around South Africa, but I will be briefed. And eventually I was briefed together with him by our commanding officer. And the scenario was that Neil Aggett, Dr. Neil Aggett in detention had hung himself, and that we were to proceed on a laissez-faire basis. I was to accompany Whitehead, given my skills at getting in, breaking into places, and being my lord, I'm trying to think of another word for a bull dust artist. We would have to create a cover story and go anywhere in South Africa and quite simply prove that Dr. Aggett was suicidal from the day he was born. The brief that we had was that the state could not afford another Ahmed Timol type event, or worse, a Biko type event where so much damage had been done to the government. So Mr. Whitehead and I set out on this trip. We started, of course, at his school in Grahamstown. We're reasonably successful, but not as far as our brief. We managed to fool a lot of people, but we didn't find out anything about him being suicidal. We then received information that his parents stayed in Somerset West, had gone away, and this proved a possible way of getting into the house and looking for stuff which could be of interest in this matter. Personal letters that he had addressed to his parents. I remember examples like, dear mom, I'm feeling so down, I'm so depressed. Anything that could come up of value where the state could ward off this thing that he'd been tortured or murdered or killed or whatever. On the night that we went to Aggett's parents' home in Somerset West, Mr. Whitehead was actually too scared to accompany me. I went on my own, and as fate would have it, I was caught in the house by the domestic assistant. And the whole cover-up attempt to this thing was bungled terribly. And yeah, the state were now sitting with, in fact, it was so bad, my lord, that the head of the security branch for the Western Cape called us personally into his office. It was a brigadier, a guy by the name of Brigadier Kotze. And he told us in no uncertain terms to get the hell out of his province because the heat was on big time. Not only had we failed in our mission, but there was another incident where the state was involved in illegal activity. I was then summoned to the Commissioner of Police's office in Pretoria, General Johan Vorster, my ex-boss. In the office was Colonel Werrak, my apologies, Colonel Gloy.
Hans Gloy.
Hans Gloy, and one or two other generals, Viljoen maybe. And a meeting was held to decide on how the state or the police were going to handle this thing about me being caught in the house. Gloy then drew up a statement, which I've got the original of, with his handwriting on it. And the story was created that I had gone to the house. We'd received information from an informer that a trade unionist, Gavin Anderson, had been hiding at the Aggett's parents' home in Somerset West. And that was the reason that I went there. Nothing to do with the trial, and it was just supposedly happenstance that Stephen Whitehead had to be there. I spent the whole day literally in the Commissioner's office, preparing the statement. They read it, reread it, read it, reread it, and at a point, Johan could see the then head of the security branch phoned the Attorney General in the Western Cape, Neil Rousseau. And he told him, Rousseau obviously knew the story, but he told him that the man is there. He'd spoken to me, and he said, are you prepared to plead guilty on this? It's not going to be held against you, and it won't go on your record, because I was studying then to get promoted. He said, in fact, it's for Volk and Vaderland, you know, the old, for the Oranje, the Blanje, and the Blauw. We would like you to go to Cape Town, and we'll arrange that some of the charges against you are dropped, but plead guilty to illegal search, and you're going to be fined 200 Rand, and we will give you the money, which I left later that afternoon with a final statement and the 200 Rand. And we headed for Cape Town, where the case came up. I pleaded guilty. The charges, 3 of the charges were withdrawn, and I paid the 200 Rand fine. What I didn't know, I might just mention, and one of the reasons why I left the service earlier was that I never passed the promotion exam suspiciously after that, and it took me 8 years to find out that it had in fact gone on my record. And when they tried to correct this, there was of course people that weren't involved in this. They said that I'm not officer material. So it cost me very dearly, and it was a very unfortunate part of my career.
Maybe the last part that's very relevant. I'm sorry about that, Mr. Erasmus, but the last part that's very relevant. Tell me, were any police witnesses prepared for this inquest of Aggett? Was there any preparation of the police witnesses for the inquest?
We had mock trials on the 10th floor, endlessly, where people like myself were called to sit in there and pretend to be, as he's in the court, Mr. Bezos, and throw questions to train Whitehead to resist this process that he had to go through. So we could think up anything that the opposition, as in Mr. Bezos here, could come out with at the trial, and that was the state's way of preparing Whitehead.
But also important, and I'll be failing my duty if I don't. Telephone tapping. Was any telephone tapping done to know what kind of line of questioning would come?
I think led by Mr. Arthur Benoni Cronwright, Colonel Cronwright, who had a pathological hatred for Mr. Bezos. In fact, told us in no uncertain terms that given any chance, we must kill him, ride over him, poison him, arrange his demise. Cronwright had it in for him very badly. But yes, his telephone was tapped, and attempts were made to bug Mr. Bezos' office. That was not my job, I must say, but I was aware of it. And I don't know if that ever succeeded, but I do remember clearly that a very successful tomato, which was our way of calling a bug, was placed in the offices of Priscilla Jana and Associates, where I think Mr. Bezos actually spent quite a lot of time. I'm not certain about that.
My Lord, that concludes my questioning for examination. Thank you.
Yes, As the court pleases. Mr. Erasmus, I just want to check, you mentioned in your oral evidence, as well as your statement, that you were with the security branch for 17 years. When did you actually join the South African police for the first time?
Immediately after matriculation, January 1975. I was in uniform branch at Cleveland, and of course, as we all know, the riots happened. My intention was to join the police, was to get out of 18 months as a so-called kanon donkey in Potchefstroom. And the easier way to get this military service out of the way was to become a policeman. So I chose that option because it was only 5 months away from home instead of 18 months away from home. But the 1976 riots had a huge effect on me. I was actually quite a religious young man, and when I saw that carnage, it in a way motivated me to see what was behind this. And I was then approached in a way, I suppose, to not end my career, but make a career in the SAP, and I was transferred to security branch in January 1977, the 11th of January.
So prior to January 77, you were just in the uniform branch doing typical policing duties?
Patrol duties, delivering summonses, the usual stuff.
If I could just ask a number of questions that arises from your evidence in chief. My learned friend, Mr. Pretorius, asked several questions relating to Stratcom. The unit in Johannesburg was, am I correct in saying that was referred to, or that had the name Intelligence Johannesburg?
My lord, these terms changed as this ballooning process happened in the security branch. There was a time C1, C2, D1, D2, which creates a lot of confusion now in retrospect. But to answer your question, sir, it would be yes, covert intelligence gathering. And just for the record, Johannesburg didn't have an individually constituted Stratcom unit because of the proximity to Pretoria. So initially, Stratcom in Johannesburg the functions were carried out by the chief Stratcom unit in the country was on the roof at Wagthuis, right on top of the building, by Colonel McIntyre and his staff. But they would call on people like me. I was eventually the guy that had to do their artwork, and they gave me a lot of pens and inks and whatever I needed.
Mr. Erasmus, would I be correct in describing the operations of Stratcom as primarily misinformation and propaganda, and ultimately to carry out a strategy of deception?
That would be a very accurate description.
You've already given us some examples, but just to complete the possible kinds of activities, was there a so-called soft Stratcom and a so-called hard Stratcom?
That is correct. A soft Stratcom would be something like the Mayakiso pamphlet, which was done very quickly and was non-illegal in the sense that there was no major crime being perpetrated here that I'm aware of. Correct me if I'm wrong. On the opposite end of the scale, I was involved in a plot, for example, where the radio announcer, Mr. John Robbie, was firing terrible shots those years at that time at the South African police. And a plot was hatched whereby we would get an agent, somebody, or one of us possibly, under a false flag, would challenge Mr. Robbie on air to come with the police and see what we actually have to deal with. And he would then be taken out to Soweto, where hello, sorry, guess what? Colonel de Kock and the Vlakplaas guys would be waiting, and they would then stage this firefight where policemen would rescue John Robbie from these balaclava and terrorists who shot him in the plan was to shoot him in the leg. That would have been our classical hard Stratcom. And there's many others, the Motherwell killings, stuff like that.
The Motherwell killings would be hard Stratcom.
Hard
presumably.
Stratcom.
So
If I may add, if I may, just for the benefit of the court, part of the reason I'm giving this evidence today was that was applied to me. They were, at a point, I found out things that I shouldn't have found out long before even the Goldstone Commission. And when they knew that there was a possibility that I would talk, de Kock himself was given instructions to blow me and my family to pieces, and my son sitting there in the court. And the clerk would have then used that as a thing that the ANC can't control the SDUs, the self-defense units running around the country. Yeah, they murder a young security policeman and his beautiful wife and kids. And that was the day that I decided, that's me, done, finished.
that was in the early 1990s?
That's correct.
Okay.
Stratcom carried on, I might just mention, 18 months after the release of Nelson Mandela in February 1990.
So the examples we've picked up in our research on Stratcom, it included a very impressive range of activities, such as putting up graffiti, fake pamphlets, as we've already heard from you, pouring paint remover over vehicles, disrupting protest gatherings, the use of stink bombs, as you've mentioned, tear gas, theft, threatening phone calls, blackmails, framing people, assault, slashing of car tires, bricks through windows, loosening wheel nuts and bolts of vehicles, firing shots at houses, arson, petrol bomb attacks on vehicles, homes and buildings. Does that all sound familiar to you?
I think the only one you possibly missed out was blowing up buildings like Casato House, because that was another Stratcom that was ordered by, I've got to choose my words here, Mr. P.W. Botha personally, with acting together with Mr. Vlok. In fact, my colleague's Eugene de Kock's first job after that job was done was to phone him in the morning and tell him that he didn't want anybody killed, that they'd carried out the operation without loss of life. That would have been a classical hard Stratcom.
So that was a bombing of a building would be regarded as hard Stratcom.
Yeah.
We've also discovered that there were other activities such as spreading disinformation about an individual in order to cause people to suspect him or her of being an agent and so to attack that person.
That is correct. I was involved in several matters like that. I don't know if you want me to elaborate.
And it's not necessary. It's not necessary. The final example we came across, and this is from the Truth Commission records, of a strategy of fabricating stories to suggest that murders and other crimes were the result of factional conflict, so-called black-on-black violence.
Well, that was the brainchild of none other than Mr. Rolf Meyer. And we were lectured extensively. I attended, I think, 2 or 3 courses on this whole principle about so-called black-on-black violence. And I don't think it hasn't been said before, but my erstwhile colleague, Mr. de Kock, was responsible for gun running to factions in KwaZulu-Natal as part of this whole thing that the black people were fighting each other more than a pending sort of racial war or a war against the nationalist government. The perception was, I must point this out, was that the Nats could do business with the Zulus, but not with anybody else. And the decisions were then made to arm them, but I'm not a specialist on that. I did participate on a very limited surface in that I donated some firearms which I had floating around to that particular project.
And actually, just a few more examples dealing with bombings. There was testimony before the Truth Commission that bomb threats and occasional bombings were used in order to create an atmosphere of fear. And so sometimes Stratcom operatives would bomb even shopping centres and movie theatres.
That is correct. I was once told, and I believe it because my very best friend and my partner was one of the people that did this. I'm talking about the late Warrant Officer R.A. Bayers. After the Magoo bombings in Durban, 2 security policemen, explosive experts, and I think Colonel de Kock might have been present, blew up the Why Not restaurant and killed people as a reprisal raid. The perception being there was that if McBride could choose a target like a little coffee shop or whatever in Durban, we could do the same with a gay club where blacks were dancing in Hillbrow. And I think probably it's not a bad estimation that 60% of the explosions that happened in Johannesburg were originated from the Johannesburg security branch. Another was Anglo-American, by the way. It was a message to them, you're going to go and deal with the ANC in Lusaka. The ANC is going to double deal you because, yeah, they're attacking 101 Main Street, Anglo-American's head office.
So just to conclude on Stratcom, looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight, would you describe it as a success or a failure?
What could I say? In some areas, it might have been a success. There's perceptions that were created those years that exist to this day. I've met a lot of the people that were my sort of personal victims, for lack of a better term, like Peter Makabe. And I spent possibly 2 hours with him explaining to him how this whole thing worked, and he was absolutely flummoxed about a security policeman saying to me, oh, let's go and have a drink, here's some money. And conveniently, there was another security cop taking a photograph, and he cracked a joke, and here's Peter Makabe smiling, and it was Captain Ervier from, I think, Pretoria security branch giving Peter Makabe money. And this thing was then spread out to say that Makabe is an agent of the security branch. And I do know that that still exists to this day. Another very famous case is, of course, Mrs. Mandela, that I was personally involved in.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Erasmus, I now want to move to the topic of John Vorster Square, and in particular to your knowledge and experience of torture and abuse that took place in John Vorster Square. Firstly, are you familiar with a particular room in the building which became known as the Varakama, or the truth room?
I am. I think the room number is, if my memory serves me correct, 1026, 10th floor.
Well, I want to show you some pictures, if I may. We have flagged the pictures. Thank you. My Lord, this is the photo album in volume F, prepared by Warrant Officer J.M. Kruger. It's the same one. Sorry, that has to go to the witness. My Lord, if I can ask you to turn to photo 37. Unfortunately, this particular album is not numbered, but each photograph is numbered, so we'll start at photo 37. Mr. Erasmus, have you found photo 37?
1 second. Yes. Do you want me to comment on it?
Yes, would that be the Vara Kama or the truth room? It would be the blue door on the right-hand side.
That is correct, but I don't believe that's room 1026. I think room 1026 was a glass-paneled room facing the outside of the building.
Yes, in actual fact, and you can see this on the following page, on photo 39, it looks like this is room 1037, and it in fact is a storeroom with no windows, round the corner from room 1026.
That's correct. I know that area particularly well, in fact.
So to be clear, from your recollection, was this the so-called Varakama, the storeroom?
It may have been used as a Varakama, but I think even in my time it was probably used as a storeroom. And I'd just like to point out the first interrogation that I ever saw actually was right next to that blue door. But there was a lot of people being held at that time. So they were all being hammered. What I'm trying to say is it wasn't always a case of the person had to be taken into X room, the door closed,
Yes.
and then beaten or interrogated.
So why was this room referred to as the Varakama, the truth room?
I think a lot of that might have been a fear factor for people that have been in detention or came back, was that, you know, you're not going to cooperate with us. You're going to go upstairs, or you'll end up in the truth room where you will speak. Much of the mechanisms of breaking a person was, as I mentioned, fear. But I think it was referred to amongst us as well as Divarakama.
And there was an expectation that if you were taken to Divarakama,
You would talk.
that some pretty brutal torture or assault would take place in the
Correct.
truth room.
The same sort of thing about the 10th floor at John Vorster Square, got this whole aura of, it was the evil 10th floor, because that was where the investigation branch were housed.
So for the record, Your Lordship, photograph 37 does depict the 10th floor. In the corner office would be room 1024. That's the office where there's also a vault. Next to it on the right would be 1025, and then there would be
1026.
room 1026. It's depicted at photo 37. It's also depicted in photo 38 and 39. That's right. That's right. It doesn't, but if you page to photo 42, I believe that is in fact 1026, so that's round the corner.
Which one? The one nearest to the camera or the one further away? The one that's open?
My Lord, my junior tells me that my eyesight's also not that great, but he tells me it's the first door that is room 1026.
On photo
On photo 42.
42.
And photo 43, I believe, is the entrance to 1025, which has an interleading door into 1024, which also has the vault. Mr. Erasmus, in your affidavit, on paragraph 6, at page 6, you make reference to the need to breaking a detainee. That's about halfway down in paragraph 6. paramount to breaking a person. Can you just explain what is meant by breaking a person?
I suppose one could define it, my lord, as where that person reached the stage where you had their cooperation 100%. They were prepared to make a confession, a written confession, and they were prepared to cooperate with the state in a trial, and if possible, an additional bonus would be where they would implicate their fellow travelers or colleagues or whatever, the people that were involved in their group.
And what was involved in breaking a person? Well, is it the same as you mentioned? You said at point 4 in your training notes, you mentioned the phrase getting to the state of totale vrees.
That's correct.
Total fear. And
Well,
what would you do to generate this totale vrees?
as we were taught, the whole secret to this interrogation was your analysis of the person that you were interrogating. What were their fears? Very important thing. I recall making, just in my own case, when this was under discussion, they asked now, what fears does one have? I'm terrified of spiders, for example, so it wouldn't take much for anybody who knew that to put a spider in my face, and I would probably tell them anything. So if a person had, for example, a fear of snakes, the same thing, a fear of heights, the same thing. You had to get to this point where that person believed that you had sole control over their life. Nobody else. You controlled their life.
And in that paragraph, you spoke of this tactic of sleep deprivation and keeping detainees awake for days on end.
That's correct.
Was that standard practice?
Standard practice.
You also spoke of a roster being drawn up for this very purpose so that the interrogators could keep going. You say teams of normally 2 or 3 people, 2 or 3 interrogators would work around the clock to keep the detainees awake.
My lord, that is 100% correct. Even us that were field workers and not on the investigation branch would be roped in to keep this process going, because there wasn't simply staff-wise enough. And like I say, it carried on. There were times, for example, over Christmas or New Year, where you had your teams there keeping those guys awake. Sleep deprivation was the basis of this interrogation.
So sometimes you would have to move detainees between officers.
That happened frequently and was an endless problem, or set of problems, as many have come to light, where people could see through that frosted glass, for example. And then you were aware that people were being moved around. Sometimes even officers on the 9th floor were used for interrogation purposes.
Were any steps taken to prevent these detainees perhaps from seeing what was going on?
They were blindfolded almost universally. If they had, for example, eventually there was an inspector of detainees, as everybody knows, was appointed, and they were prepared and allowed to rest or whatever. They were taken to a room which was, of course, had a tomato in it, which is a bug, in case any messages passed, and they would be taken there totally disorientated, but the blindfolds would be removed sort of just around the corner, and they would have an opportunity to see a mother or a wife or whatever.
When they were moved, you said they had a blindfold. Did they have anything else on their heads? A hood, anything of that nature?
No. The hoods were, I think the Americans call it waterboarding, was putting a wet bag over
yes,
somebody's
no, I'm
face.
talking about something to obscure vision.
Yes, no, absolutely.
So when they were being moved in the corridors,
They were blindfolded.
they were blindfolded, either with a blindfold or
with a bag, a loose
Or a
cotton
bag.
bag.
Can you explain to the court whether electric shocks were used, and if so, Do you have any experience of yourself applying electric shock treatment?
My Lord, I sadly do, and this was in Novemberland. But my first experience of an electric shock was that these were used very widely in the police, not only by the security police, and that was as a young constable at Bedfordview Police Station, where the detectives had these little shock machines, which everybody had from the old telephone system, the old slinger system. So you had this little machine which you could wind it up, and the intensity of the voltage coming through these two wires would increase proportionate to the amount of how much you spun this thing up. And in later years, these machines became known as Radio Moscow. And a lot of jokes in the security branch went down accordingly, where a detainee would be told, we're going to let you listen to the radio. Radio Moscow, have you ever heard of it? So they were very widely used. I can't think that I used it myself, but I knew how it worked.
Were you aware of the electric shock practice occurring in John Vorster Square?
Correct, I was.
And was it a common occurrence for detainees who were not cooperating with the security
A
branch?
very common occurrence, my Lord. I think there was very few people that could withstand being shocked like that. I can just mention to the court as well, and I'm not proud to mention this, in Namibia I saw refinements of this where the two electrodes were wrapped in cotton wool and they were dipped into water and pushed into somebody's ears or onto their genitals, which increases that flow of electricity considerably. And the most terrible one I ever mentioned up there, I know it's outside the realms of South Africa, was a detainee actually bite half of their tongue away, which left most of us absolutely, I must say, horrified, despite the fact that we were in a war zone. There was no niceties. And that was from being shocked through the ears.
Mr. Erasmus, you're free to sit down. You don't have to stand. So, on the question of electric torture, would you say that the practice at John Vorster Square was pretty much standard practice for interrogation purposes?
I think for a seasoned interrogator, it was pretty much standard.
You made reference to the, I think you've referred it to the investigation section of the security branch that was based on the 10th floor. I'm just looking at my notes, and you mentioned that I think the words you used were notorious. If I'm correct with that description, why did you use such a word to describe the investigation section of the security branch?
My Lord, the security branch was headed by a man by the name of, a colonel by the name of Arthur Benoni Cronrod. He was English speaking, and he was also known in security branch terms as Little Hitler. This man was absolutely mentally unstable. And he terrified us as much as what he terrified, I think, the detainees, especially if you weren't on his staff or if you fell into bad books with Cronrod like I did. I was also his little star pupil at one time because of his very disheveled personal life. He was married several times, drank excessively, and did outrageous things, and it was a source of amazement and amusement in some areas, and certainly shock in other areas, that this man was allowed such an important position. And I think the reason that he was allowed to carry on for all these years as head of the investigation branch was that he was very successful. Cronrod would rather have been on that 10th floor any day than in, the court can name it, Hawaii, Mauritius, or whatever. He was totally fanatical about his job, and hence the name Little Hitler. So he had quite a reputation in the police force generally, as well as a guy that you didn't even think about crossing swords with.
Mr. Erasmus, have you heard the term resident sweeper And if so, what does it mean?
The police force had several sweepers, and this was where a member of the force got into trouble. In my case, the sweepers that I referred to, as I testified earlier on, would have been Gloy, and they were sweeping up the bits there and finding a way out. John Vorster Square, being John Vorster Square, had a brigadier whose name escapes me. He was the resident sweeper. And anybody, like happened to me, I was accused by Reverend Bishop Peter Story of defacing the walls of Central Methodist Church. And he hit the nail on the head because I was part of it. But I had to stand on an ID parade, which was then rigged by the sweeper. And this guy was a specialist at it. He had photographs of all the resident troublemakers in John Vorster Square and around, and of course everybody in the security branch. So when this incident happened, I was summoned to sit in front of him, and he looked at my facial features and that. I had a beard at that time, and he said to me, I want you to take your beard off, keep a Fu Manchu type thing, and for Pete's sake, cut your hair. And what were you wearing at the time? I had to obviously wear something different. And then he would stack the parade with other people that had similar appearances. And at times, the accused was never on the parade. I can tell the court that as a matter of fact. I mean, these things were setups.
So this resident sweeper practice, it was essentially about, if I hear you correctly, concealing evidence, keeping certain evidence away from courts, but also fabricating or ensuring false evidence goes to court to ensure that the police cannot be fingered in a particular crime.
That is totally correct, and I've remembered his name. It was Brigadier Quartus Grobler.
And do you recall for how long this practice had been going? Had it already started by the time you came to the security branch?
My Lord, this was right through my career. It was in practice when I was in the security branch, started in the security branch. I can just mention, I think this would have emerged quite strongly at the TRC, was from the Vlakplaas side of things. When those revelations were made, the sweeper would have been General Engelbrecht, Krappies Engelbrecht, who I didn't know that much personally.
So are you saying that whenever the police were accused, be it of a torture, be it of murder, or some other misdemeanor, the resident sweeper will be brought in to ensure that the police would not have to, would be able to escape justice, and perhaps the reputation of the police would be kept intact?
That is correct. That is 100% correct. I think what can bear testimony to the effectiveness of this is maybe somebody can provide statistics on how many policemen were ever charged. It's very few, certainly in my time in the security branch, very few. I don't know of any that I can think of offhand, barring myself, of course, where even that was a setup.
Well, perhaps that's some research that we'll have to do before this inquest ends.
Just on that, before you proceed, Mr. Vani, this unit that operated as a sweeper, was it also located on the 10th floor? Or was it elsewhere in the
My
building?
Lord, no. He was, Quartus Grobler, the sweeper was, I think, Deputy District Criminal Investigation Officer. But it was almost like he was an extension of the security police. He was invited to all our functions. He was a person that we looked after. He was regularly given, done favors, and somebody that we had to protect. That was the relationship with Grobler. In fact, I worked with his son for a period of about a year. And that's basically what his job was problem solving.
So he was stationed where? In the detective branch?
Detective branch. He wasn't on any of the security branch floors. I think they were on the fifth floor, John Vorster Square at that time.
And you say when you joined the police, this practice had been existing?
That is correct.
Okay. You may proceed. You may proceed, Mr.
As a conclusion. Mr. Erasmus, just one question of Stratcom. You mentioned in your evidence in chief that it became formalized, I think you said, in 1983 with various structures. I'd like to know what was going on before 1983. Were there still practices of deception, faking pamphlets and the like, going on before Stratcom was formalized in 1983?
That is correct. I think if I can just go back on what I said previously and just be given the indulgence to just expand there a little bit, the sweeping system would have been in effect. It would have been in effect for a long time prior to that. From when I joined the security branch, well, I didn't expect anything less, but I mean, I knew from the start with these nocturnal activities, we were not going to get caught or get into trouble. You were being protected, or you would be protected if things went wrong. I mean, the man that gave us those instructions was a very senior policeman, and I can actually recount to the court times where a policeman refused. One of them was a Sergeant King. He refused to partake or break the law, and he was promptly removed from the security branch and transferred somewhere else. So it was actually a very institutionalized part of the system that we worked in. I missed part of your question.
No, thanks. That's particularly useful to hear. I want to return just briefly to the kinds of operations that Stratcom carried out, the misinformation, the deceptions, the putting together of fake pamphlets and the like. The evidence you gave is that Stratcom was formalized into the organizational structure, I think, from 1983. So my question is, were these kinds of activities happening prior to 83 as well?
Most definitely. I actually got hold of, from the good officer of the Mail and Guardian, the minutes of the meeting in 1983 with all the cabinet members sitting there and what was put on the table by each one. And the police were running then a thing called Support the Police Action Group. Let me just think. The South African Defence Force, who were the most heavily defunded, had a group going that the previous year arranged for people to go into Bishop Tutu's office and throw 30 pieces of silver in his face as the mark of a traitor. Now, they had a name. There was all these little splinter groups. So everybody at that meeting had to put their things on the table and decide whose. They used the term line function. The line function of the South African Police would have been X, Y, and Z. Boss of the Bureau of State Security had their functions and so on. But the operations were in effect, to answer your question, that's out of your question, long before 1983.
Including in the 1970s?
Most definitely. The posters that I put up started almost, in the 70s, 1977.
So in fact, for this kind of work, and I think in particular in relation to your work around discrediting Winnie Mandela and also getting certain heads of state, I think you mentioned John Major, to reduce their donation to the ANC or Mandela, as well as getting footage onto Japanese TV, you said you received no less than 7 commendations.
That is correct, my Lord.
And these commendations, what did they say?
It was a letter. I mean, if they'd given me some money, I might have been more impressed. But if they'd even promoted me, I might have been impressed. I just got these letters, and I was sort of feted at places. I would go to head office, and I was treated as somebody way above my actual rank. And the most notable thing mentioning money was that a man who eventually became the head of C1 and C2, who today I think runs a string of hardware stores here in Pretoria, Brigadier Oosthuizen, Alfred Oosthuizen, also known as the Guru. He went to the commissioner to try and sort out this thing about my career, and I got merit promotions for the commendations. But so did everybody else get merit commendations. So it was just a matter of keeping us happy, but I don't want to bore the court with more of that.
So the commendation letters wouldn't necessarily point out the great projects you had pulled off.
In some cases they did.
Is that
Sorry
so?
that I interrupted.
Do you perchance still in possession of one or more of these letters of commendation?
I don't have it with me, but I can quote you word for word. It says, meneer Adjutant-officier Erasmus het met groot ywer 'n suksesvolle aksie geloods in Groot-Brittanje en something about dra hoofkantoor se goeie wense oor or something. These type of things went on your record in your streep something file. I don't know about that side of things where you'd done good, and your streep 7 was where you'd smashed up government property or got drunk or whatever.
If you are able to locate one or more of those letters of commendation, we would like to inspect them, Mr. Erasmus.
My Lord, I think Dr. Pretorius might have a copy, not quite certain.
I will get copies. I have got copies. I'll get the copies.
Yeah.
I do have copies with me, but not here. I've got them at the place where I'm staying.
But even where they didn't mention a particular success of yours, were you left in no doubt that you were being given these letters of commendation for doing specific good work that may very well have been unlawful?
That is correct. There was also, I must just explain this, there was also a need-to-know principle. So you wouldn't have, for example, General Johan Kutsia sending a letter of commendation where he gave details of the operation, because a lot of people would see that. So we tried to, like any other intelligence gathering body in any country in the world, there was the need-to-know principle. You were only told what you needed to know. And in that way, you maintained security. Well, that's the theory behind it, anyway.
But for example, a letter of commendation that just was general in nature, you would know for what it was because it would come shortly after one of your successes.
Correct. Like the one that I mentioned about Great Britain was, I knew it was about the John Major story.
Mr. Erasmus, why was it necessary, why do you think you were given instructions to find evidence or some kind of support for Aggett's, if I may put in inverted commas, suicide?
The state needed to, for lack of a better legal term, win the inquest, in that Stephen Peter Whitehead and the security branch could walk out of there and say the man was never tortured. This was not a Biko situation where the state took such a hiding, as it were. There was 5 corvettes, I think, that were already manned by South African sailors. They actually frog-marched them off, and the French kept their ships. That was the Biko situation was a devastating set of events for the country, and the powers that be, right to the top, were under no illusion that the death of Aggett was going to be a similar thing. And it was also seen in a more similar thing, seen in a worse light, because their thinking was, I think he was the first white detainee that died in detention that I know of. I could be correct on incorrect on that, my lord. So there was, and it was for that reason we were given laissez-faire. Planned this thing. We had a state psychologist that phoned Whitehead every day, that gave him instructions, and he sort of guided us through the process. When we went to Kingswood College in Grahamstown to go and so-called this, the cover story incidentally was that I was representing a journalist who didn't want to be named, who was going to write a book on Aggett's life. So my brief was, as Mr. Paul Edwards then, because of my signature, gather information, as much information as possible, with Whitehead hovering in the background type of stuff.
So you got the distinct impression that you were instructed to build a case, build a version of suicide?
That is correct. In fact, before I was caught in the house, I got a bundle of letters which Whitehead, but maybe not the state psychiatrist, who I think was a Dr. Plomp. He was the guy that phoned us every day, twice a day. We had to update him. I think he was at UNISA. He was a professor of psychology or psychiatry. I don't think that I met him. But I know Whitehead took these calls the whole day, and then we'd go through whatever we'd picked up. At Kingswood College, it was devastating, because if there was anybody that was not a suicide case, it was Neil Aggett. He had a fantastic childhood career. I mean, we were absolutely blown away. The headmaster remembered him obviously very clearly, took us on a guided tour through the school, and there was Neil in every positive light that one could think. Not what you would expect from a severely depressed, traumatized child. Although, with respect to the family, I don't think that he had an easy life being in boarding school for most of his life. But he certainly shone as a youngster.
All right, well, we can't go into too much detail on the case of Neil Aggett.
Except, if I may ask this question. While we are on the mission to do the sweeping, if I may call it that way, do I understand you to say that state pathology at that time were involved in this?
That is correct, my lord. They were not part of the security branch. There
Yes.
was, over the years that I was in the security branch, eventually we had people that were almost part of us, ranging from senior state prosecutors, academics across the board. Most of the Stratcom courses that I went on, they had UNISA, a lot of people from UNISA and Tukkies would come and lecture us. And they were also party to a lot of the projects, were set up not by security policemen, but were set up by people that, one of them, and might be a bit of a shock, was at Wits University, that were specialists in the field of international politics, psychology and psychiatry and that. So we had a lot of outside guidance on this. Most definitely, my lord.
Would that have included the magistrates?
Would that, I beg your pardon?
Would that have included magistrates? During trials, during inquests, would magistrates be schooled as to
well, my
how
lord,
to deal with these?
The meeting that I had with the Commissioner of Police, that magistrate was told what sentence, and I remember could see her saying to the Cape Attorney General, he said, "Die man," they spoke in Afrikaans, but I'll translate into English. He said, "The man is standing in front of me, and we will give him the money." I think I went from there and I was given the 200 Rand, but when I arrived at the trial, I knew exactly minute for minute what was going to happen. Although for an eye blind, they did appoint an advocate for me, which was actually very embarrassing. I don't know who was more embarrassed, him, Whitehead, or I, because there was nothing to really defend. We knew what was going to be the outcome. So to get back to what my lord was asking, yes, the magistrate most certainly knew, because he found me. And it went very quickly. I think we were only in the court for, half an hour. This guy just said, okay, illegal search, blah, 200 rand, or I think 6 months. And I started to take the money out there on the spot. And they said, no, you've got to pay it outside, and that was the end of the matter.
So he delivered a sentence exactly as you were told before you went there.
That is correct, my lord.
You may proceed.
Mr. Erasmus, do you have any other experiences in which magistrates agreed to issue certain findings or do anything else for the police of an illegal nature?
I must say, my lord, I can't think of anything that just comes to mind. I'm certain if one takes into account, if I look at Johannesburg Security Branch, I might shock the court now by saying something that the most powerful jurist that we had to deal with was, of course, Mr. Klaus van Lierus und Welkau, was the guest of honor at every security branch, braai, party, drink up, food competition or whatever. He was absolutely a guy that we treasured along with the sweeper. He was a guest at everything. So on a very small scale, if I was ever arrested, for example, for speeding, I would go to the senior public prosecutor at Johannesburg Court, and I'd walk in there and nolly prosecutor.
Was it
And if it was worse than that, it would be that Mr. van Lierus would sort it out.
Was he the van Lierus that became the Attorney General at some point?
That's correct.
Oh, I see. Okay.
On that score, Mr. Erasmus, are you aware of any inquests in which prosecutors have agreed to play a certain role on behalf of the security branch?
You mean, sir, as in not prosecute as much as they should be prosecuted? I can't say that I have personal knowledge. I suppose one could always speculate, but I can't say that with definite.
Returning to John Vorster Square, and in particular the section dealing with the security branch, am I correct in saying that the entire 9th and 10th floors were strictly confined for security branch activities and nobody else was permitted to be there?
That's totally correct. Together with, as the branch got bigger and bigger and bigger, they took over the first and the second floors. So it would have been 10th floor still investigation branch, 9th floor field workers. The ground floor was the, shall we say, the postal department where they had the old chaps steaming the letters open. And that would have been the first floor. Ground floor, sorry, and the first floor was then also taken over by the investigation branch, units of the investigation branch. We were just running out of space. All of that was a no-go area with huge steel doors, some of them remote controlled, and all gates, which was bunches of keys, like almost too heavy to pick up.
So security was pretty tight. There was 24/7 round-the-clock guarding of those floors, and even after hours it would have been securely
That is
up.
correct. Even the lifts, the air vents in the lifts were sealed, which nearly cost me and 10 people our lives when we got stuck in the lifts, which was regular. But they spared no expense in securing that area. The simple reason that is on the 9th and the 10th floor, there was an area of the passage that had these electric doors. Probably the most sensitive stuff in the South African police was the WH, or telephone interceptions. Those lines were run into those hundreds of tape recorders that were housed in that section.
So aside from protecting the personnel and the documents and perhaps the various devices that you had there, you presumably wanted to ensure that detainees who were held on those floors, that there was no possibility of them escaping, and they would be very closely guarded.
My Lord, after the second death, would have been the third death, which I was there the day that it happened, was Matthews Mabulani. Fell from the 10th floor, but on the opposite side of the building. He was in the main part, being held in the main part or interrogated. I know he was in an office with 2 black policemen, one whom I remember. They then decided to put burglar bars on the inside of all the floors where the security branch were. But prior to that, there was just these big windows, which every second or third one opened, which was almost like a door. And while one would assume nobody would climb up the outside, it was certainly done. And I mean, there was no beating around the bush. It was to stop people from trying to escape, falling out of the windows, and also provide additional security, although it wasn't necessary.
So security was quite tight. But certainly in October of 1971, Mr. Timol himself was able to exit the building, notwithstanding the available security. The individual who was allegedly in the room with him in 1026 was a Mr. Rodriguez. His evidence before the first inquest is that he attempted to prevent the escape or exit, but was unable to do so. Nonetheless, just a few days before the inquest magistrate, Mr. de Villiers, handed down his finding, Mr. Rodriguez was issued with a letter of commendation for his exemplary service. Are you surprised to hear that he was given such a letter?
I am quite surprised, I must say. I'm quite fascinated. How would I comment on this? In my time, every effort was made to, obviously because of Timol's death and Biko, there was rules, I think, that Cronrath even drew up. But I think those rules were always there. You were never left alone with the detainee, for starters. And it would go further than even 2 people with a detainee. And that was already in effect when I arrived at the security branch. I can maybe just give an example, a very bad example to the court, but he is an attorney today, could verify what I'm saying. One of the more embarrassing interrogations that I saw was walking into office one day, and there was this Indian gentleman standing there with a beard, and he never had a stitch of clothing on. And people were coming and going. But there was about 5 people in the office. He was being interrogated. And I'm talking about, I think he's a practicing attorney today, Mr. Hanif Valley. I saw him, in fact, at the TRC.
Was it ever practice in your experience to leave an important security detainee alone in the company of an administrative clerk, a pay clerk, or somebody providing coffee?
No, my Lord, the regulations regarding those buildings and the maintenance of security, nobody, including other members of any other units in the police, ever came in there unless there was a valid reason they were invited or they had some function to perform. It wasn't a case of you just walked in or out of there. Those offices were set up, as I understood it, from when that building was built, because the security branch used to be housed in a commercial building that was rented by the government known as the Greys. And when I went there, that building was obviously purpose-built. These doors, which must have cost the earth, steel, you're talking about a steel door that big with huge motors to allow access. There's no ways that anybody could walk in or out of there that wasn't a member of the security branch. And even then, as members of the security branch, and as somebody that was regarded as a senior member, I had no access. And I can mention this to, for example, where the old chap sat and opened the envelopes. I think I was in that office twice during my whole career. And that was because I was a stamp collector. And you can draw your own conclusions on that. But I shouldn't have been there. Even for us, it had signs, restricted area, no admittance, authorized personnel only.
My Lord, it is lunchtime. I still have a few more questions, but I suggest we take the lunch adjournment.
Yes, we will continue at 2 o'clock, 1400 hours. We will take an adjournment at this stage. Yes, and what happened to the attorney who was here? Is that Mr. Thompson? He needs to put himself on the roll. Okay.